Here we go. We are live in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Welcome to WIIL2B podcast with your host.
It's me, Yeefah. All right, here we go. Put us in.
You're muted.
Okay. Let's see. Looks like we are live. All right. Welcome, welcome, welcome. This is my first time doing this, so it's hard to tell if I am live or not. It would be great if people could put in the comments that they can hear me, that they can see me, and then I would know that, oh, great. People can see us and hear us, so that's awesome. All right, so welcome tonight to the first episode of What Is It Like to Be? And tonight we are going to find out what it's like to be Rito Martinez, who was born to undocumented parents who were deported, and he became an award-winning educator, a social justice advocate, and a racial healing facilitator. And I want to just say before we get started, please like and subscribe, hit that subscribe button, hit all the notifications so you can hear and get the next episode, which will be happening in 2 weeks. Rito, thank you so much for joining me tonight. This is such an honor to be here with you and for you to be my first guest. You don't know this little known fact I'm going to tell you, that you actually are the reason why I started this podcast.
Awesome. Fantastic.
I just always, have felt so drawn to you. And when I was stalking you on the internet, one of your former students in a video said that you were just such a warm, big teddy bear, and that she felt like your passion and all the parents and everyone just always loved you. And I felt that way every time I saw you, and I was just drawn into you and just wanted to really converse with you and find out more about you. We work together sometimes, but I wanted to really dig deep and to find out what drives you. What is it like to be Rito Martinez? And so I just want to thank you so much for being with me. Can you tell me a little bit about what I'm really, really interested in is your beginnings? The fact that your parents were deported. Your father was deported first while your mother was pregnant. And I would love to hear about what that was like for you, being born to a situation with undocumented parents. You grew up in Mexico for part of the time and then came here.
Sure. Again, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be in community with you. So grateful for you and your journey of healing and liberation. Also respect your narrative and your story and how you are becoming whole, and also using your talents and your wisdom to empower and love others. So full of gratitude to you, and thank you for the honor of being the first guest. Before we begin, I would just love to acknowledge the land that we sit on. We are the land of the Council of Three Fires, of the Native Americans who tended to the soil, the Potawatomi, the Ojibwa, the Miami, and love to acknowledge them for their stewardship, and invite all of us to think about the land that we currently navigate as well. And just also would love to acknowledge all of our collective ancestors, the ancestors that you bring, Yeefah, the ancestors that I bring, and the collective wisdom that they have, and invite them to the room and invite them to bless all those that are tuning in and creating a circle with us this evening. So yes, the saying is that I was born at the expense of my father witnessing my birth. My parents came to Chicago, like many immigrants, looking for a better life, looking for opportunities for their children, looking for opportunities for themselves. And very quickly, the American dream became the American nightmare. this issue of separation and borders and divisions and the harm that is still occurring currently to families, to children who currently sit in detention centers and cages, awaiting this transition, and the horrible fear and trauma that they're experiencing. And so I'd love to pause and just understand that, feel that for them, so that some of that could be lessened for them.
I guess I'm wondering, when you're talking about that trauma, do you feel like when you were born that trauma that was infected, that affected your parents, then transferred to you? I mean, you do a lot of racial healing work and you do a lot of trauma body work. And I'm just curious, looking back, as an adult now, can you see how your parents, behaved from like trauma mindset, trauma body, and how maybe you would have responded to that in that way?
Sure. I firmly believe in the study of epigenetics, where we do carry cellular trauma from our ancestors, including from my parents. And when my father was deported, the judge was very lenient, and the laws back then were much more lenient and kind to families. I was born in 1968, and allowed my mother to stay, and allowed her to stay and give birth to me. And when I was born here, I became a citizen. And then we quickly left back to Mexico to reunite with my father. And then through my citizenship, they were able to become residents and return 6 years later. But it really did cause some significant instability, both in their relationship and also in the parenting and caretaking that all children deserve. And so a big part of my story is, when in the absence of love, in the absence of stability, in the absence of what children need most, which is that safety, we experience so much significant loss and trauma and harm and deep insecurity. And often, and my journey has been to reconcile that loss, to reconcile that loss of love, reconcile that loss of that significant insecurity that I felt as a child as a result of this trauma and the transition, the violent transitions between both countries. And the question is, what do I do with that? How do I respond to that? And my response and my journey has been to become the love that I didn't really feel and receive as a child, and to process the childhood trauma that I did experience through that lens, and have that inform my liberation, and have that inform my why of why I do this work, instead of having that be something that hinders and continues to create and deny my ability to be fully whole and fully healed from that experience.
I mean, the fact that you have gotten to that place is really amazing. I think most people who are born into traumatic experiences, and Black and brown people have been born into traumatic experiences generationally. And they did studies on Holocaust survivors and what that effect is. And they found out that your genes actually do change. And so that the child is then operating from the same place of trauma that as the parent was, even though the child didn't experience the trauma. Right. So if you have post-traumatic stress and you are constantly on guard, you are constantly in fear, right? The child didn't have that trauma, right? The child didn't have the trauma of being in a concentration camp. The child didn't have that trauma of being deported, at the time, like your dad did or like your mom did. But you have that same genetic predisposition because it was passed down to you through your mother from that trauma. And that to me is really fascinating. And I feel like if we as people, Black and brown people, could start to really tap into that and really understand that most of us are operating with this like trigger mechanism, we just jump at certain things not really realizing that it's because of the trauma that we've experienced. And I'm just wondering how you have noticed that too as a principal. Oh, wait, before we go into that, oh my gosh, this totally blew my mind when I was, again, stalking you on the internet. You became the founding principal of a school, a social justice school that came about from 19 days of a hunger strike. I was like, what is this? How did this even happen? And like, so tell me about that. Like, what was that about? And I think, again, that probably leads into and is part of the whole trauma experience that community was going through.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're right. I think we as a community, people of color, need to really understand and do the somatic body awareness healing work to really process it and understand both the trauma that we experience and the trauma that we carry. Mm-hmm. I think what was really important for me to also understand and to learn is that not only do we carry the trauma at the cellular level, right? That and there's studies that say it could go back all the way 14 generations that we carry this cellular ancestral trauma. But at the same time, we also have to acknowledge and claim and reclaim and live that we also carry that the wisdom of our communities of survival. And that wisdom of survival, of their resiliency, we also carry that in our DNA. And we also carry that at the cellular level as well. And so we have to approach it from that holistic perspective, not only of the trauma that we carry, but of the wisdom and of the medicine and of the healing that we also carry from our ancestors who have survived amazing traumatic experiences, and the traumatic experiences we ourselves are continuing to survive even now.
Right.
And so I think, and that has to happen in community. Our experience in our healing is collectivist in perspective, and so we have to draw upon the stories and the wisdom of our ancestors in circle, in community, with others. And that is what will then create liberation and healing for all of us, not only right now, but in the future, right? There's a 7th generation principle that talks about we are at the crossroads of 7 generations that have come before us. And all the work that we do right now is for 7 generations that will come after us.
So powerful.
We have to acknowledge that the way that we want to live right now will impact my granddaughter's granddaughter. Mm-hmm. And so the question is, if that's the case, then what is my calling? What is my why? What do I have to do right now so that 7 generations forward, things will be different? 7 generations forward, things will be more whole. 7 generations forward, we're not talking about the trauma, but we're talking about our collective liberation as people of color. And so to me, I want us to also focus on the healing and transformation and collective liberation work that we need to do alongside of the healing and trauma that we have to do as well. And so the high school is a manifestation of that. I grew up in a little village, and it was an honor to serve my community in that role. The community was organized by an amazing organizer named Tomas Gaete, who organized through block clubs and asked community members what they most needed. And they all said that we needed a new high school in the community. The community was divided by gang lines, and there wasn't a viable option for a certain number of students in the community, including when I went to high school. I couldn't go to the neighborhood high school because of the same reason. And so through a 2-year period of organizing and the community discovering their collective power, they began to protest and do sit-ins and do every single mechanism of good organizing to have the city of Chicago recognize the community's power. And it didn't happen. Up to the point where the Mayor Daley, was going to be reelected, and he used education as a campaign to be reelected. And then he allocated funding for a new school. So after a 2-year battle, the community felt extremely proud and galvanized by this victory, only for that money to be misspent, used for other projects. When the facility and the rezoning and the remediation of the land stopped. And so at that point, the community looked at itself and said, what are we going to do? We've done everything in our power to address this issue. For our power and our dignity and our humanity to be recognized, what are we going to do? And at that moment, somebody said, why don't we look to our ancestors, to what they did? Mm. And at that moment, I think the portals opened and the inspiration came. And at that moment, somebody said, let's go on a hunger strike. Just like Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta and other movements across the world use this as a means of, again, having their power be recognized and seen and valued. And so they waged a 19-day hunger strike. And that was the first day of the hunger strike is when I became involved. I was going home to visit my mom, and I saw the campsite, and I knew that's exactly where I needed to be. After 19 days, Ari Duncan was appointed. The community continued to demand that their power be recognized. There was funding, and then there was a 2-year process of organizing, continuing the values of the grassroots effort to give life to the brick and mortar of the new high school. And in that 2-year process, the community asked me if I would be willing to be one of the founding principals. And it was an overwhelming sense of responsibility and obligation, but also of love, that I left the classroom after 12 years to probably do the most challenging job I've ever done, which is to lead that school. But I had a lot of, again, in community, having a lot of elders and ancestors and guides and mentors that said, Rita, the first thing you have to do is not create a school based on who you are, but based on values. These values are right. Will be sustained. And it's been one of my probably greatest accomplishments that I was able to walk away after 5, almost 6 years being the founding principal, and the school still remains cemented and focused on the values that we originated from day one, and it continues to do amazing work.
What I found interesting when I was looking at it, I think there are 3 campuses. One is for arts, and one is for social justice, which is the one that you were leading. And what was the other one for?
World language and mathematics.
World language and mathematics. And you know, the fact that there was a social justice school. I mean, I'm from New York City, and we have these specialized schools, and I've never heard of anything like that, where there's a social justice school where you're actually learning about social justice. And I'm wondering, is that sort of where you kind of started launching into getting more into social justice and working in the community? I mean, you came from being a teacher and working with the students, but now you work so much with the community. That's how I know you. And was that sort of the beginning part for you?
That's a great question. The inception or my entry into really understanding and seeing education as a tool of social justice, as a tool of liberation, happened when I was a teacher. And so I was invited by John Donahue, who became one of my mentors, who was an old Catholic priest who was excommunicated and was the founder, one of the executive directors of the Chicago Coalition for the Homeless. And he was leading a liberation theology workshop. And he invited me to come as a second-year classroom teacher. And that workshop just completely changed my life. Mm. I saw the connection between education, critical education, the knowledge that our students are needing to consume around their identity and their role in justice movements and liberation from a perspective of pedagogy. And we all know Pedagogy of the Oppressed, but Pablo Freire. And so that became a critical element of my work, of my pedagogy. And it also became a critical element of my own healing. Because when you're doing that type of work with students around their identity and understanding who they are in this country as immigrants, as people that are assimilating and being harmed in that assimilation, and having them understand and reclaim their identity, it also heals you. And so that became extremely important for me. And my classroom, I would say, I say teaching saved my life, because it really allowed me to reclaim and to center myself after spending 4.5 years in a really difficult white serving institution. College messes so many people up, especially people of color. And so we needed to come and reprogram almost ourselves, and that classroom space became that. And so when I went over and I found the hunger strike, I knew exactly that's where I needed to be, and I continued my journey into critical pedagogy and popular education as a liberatory tool. And so one of the things I learned that really helped me transition is that my why, and it continues to be my why. I'm so thankful that my why and my values are in complete alignment. Was that my why as a classroom teacher was to love and transform and elevate the lives of my students. And when I transitioned into the role of principal, I was really afraid. I was like, man, this is really overwhelming. What am I going to do? And it clicked. And I said, my job is to love and transform the lives of my teachers so that they could transform the lives of our students. And then that really just became my why for doing the work that I do, is to love, transform, and elevate the lives of leaders of color, of people of color, of communities of color. And as long as I'm in alignment to my why, then I am rooted, and I'm anchored, and I am powerful, and I am good. And there's beautiful things that actually happen. And so I'm really grateful that I was able to find my why very early on. And now that I'm in my 50s, it has been such a powerful anchoring way to just lead and move in a very liberated way to continue making the impact that I really desire.
Can you give the guests some clues on how you discovered your why? I mean, I feel like there are a lot of people out there that don't know their why, and could you give some tips on like someone who's searching for that and how they could go about finding that?
Yeah, absolutely. I do that in my executive coaching practice. And so I think really digging deep and understanding what your values are, and values that are encompassing not just of the accomplishments that you want to make or the money that you want to make, values that are rooted in community and in culture. That's the difference. And so a value of love is a critical value. A value of elevating and transforming other people's lives for them to have impact is transformative. And so really trying to root my values in transformation and not in the transactional is really was helpful for me. I think I discovered my why as a classroom teacher, and then I was able to transition that same why as an administrator and a school leader. And then I got stuck a little bit where I thought that my why and the role were something to be negotiated. So when I left the principalship, I worked at the University of Chicago. I worked at different other organizations. And I thought that the role that I had, whether it was transformation leader or director of leadership development or director of principal development or vice president of program development, I thought that those two things needed to be in alignment or symbiotic, and I kind of lost myself a little bit. And I was what's freeing when we say the why is the why, the role is secondary. And so that was really freeing for me when I discovered, and that hit me. was like, oh, it's the why. Everything else should be secondary, tertiary to your why. And that really allowed me to feel and operate in a much more liberated sense, liberated space.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the same sort of process that I take some of my clients through, around, having them show up authentically, show up in their power, show up and anchored and rooted in their why. And then everything else is secondary.
So how does that work if you, let's say for people who are watching, they're already in their job and they found out their why is nothing to do with their job, like nothing to do with what they're doing? How do they begin to unpack that and transition into something else?
Yeah, really slowly. Really
Right.
right? Really slowly and really carefully. Like, that there are folks that have this sort of moment, this crisis, existential crisis, like, no, like I am completely lost. And I think, no, it's important just to take a deep breath. Again, connect with your body, connect somatically.
Like those layers are peeling, right?
Yes, right. Ask the ancestors for guidance. Just breathe through it, and keep aligning yourself with your values, and then experience those little by little. Like, how did it feel to walk into a meeting differently and say something differently that was from your values and not from your role or from a transactional lens? How did it feel? Let's process it. And then how did it feel when you did it? And it's okay, and love and dispensation and kindness. So it's definitely a process and a journey. And oftentimes it's also, you have to do it in community. Who's going to support you in that process? Who's with you in that journey? And how can you share that and be really open and model that with really transformative transparency, that this is exactly what you're doing? Because what happens is it's also a really powerful way to know who your people are. Because there are some people that will fall away and say, and you will lose. And that's actually really good pruning, where we really identify who our people are during that transition.
Yeah. I'd like to invite anyone, if they have any questions, please add them into the chat. We're going to continue talking, but I just want you to know that you please, if you'd like questions that you'd like to ask Rito about what he's talking about, please put them in the chat and I'll ask him. Some really cool things that have been happening, so far, Rito, in the comments, people are saying like they love some of the things you've said, like love and transformation and elevate. Jamel Rackley said, love that, love transformation and elevate. Lawrence Davis said, I love that. What is my why? Which I think is so great. So many of us are really struggling with that. And I appreciate you breaking that down for us to really understand. I think the part that you were talking about when you said unpacking it slowly, is so powerful, because we're in a society where everything is like rush, like you just want to get to the end. And I keep saying to myself, when I'm feeling like that, slow and steady wins the race.
Absolutely.
It's like the tortoise, not the hare, just doing it slowly, and you start to feel, and sometimes it's okay to be sitting in your body and feeling nervous, feeling, fear, or processing those feelings. And then that gets you through to the next level. Would you say that's sort of something you work through with your clients?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like really also invite all of us to remove and to reimagine time as nonlinear. Like, can we reimagine time as it being cyclical, circular, where there's really no beginning and no end, where we're on just a collective journey of discovery, of healing, and of transformation. I think sometimes as we're navigating white body supremacy and this toxic culture where individualism, performance, success based on transactionalist metrics, we get caught up in thinking that we have to have certain things done by certain times, and it's very linear. and it's hierarchical, and I think that's not who we are originally as people of color, of indigenous African ancestry. Like, we are a collectivist culture. Ubuntu is important in the foundation of who we are. Again, that's the ancestral wisdom that we also carry. And so to know that this one dot in your journey will inform and will give you wisdom and will give you understanding for 2 or 3 dots that you can't even see ahead,
Yeah.
to make you feel much more present to
Yes.
what actually is happening. And oftentimes we just lose sight of the moment, and we lose sight of where we are currently, that we just lose so much. And so oftentimes, I ask clients, what is this rush? What is this pressure keeping you from? And oftentimes keeps us from being present, being mindful, being in love with ourselves, and being able to create beautiful things with one another. And so I think that's incredibly important. And I also just want to recognize that this is what you're hearing is a culmination of 52 years of my own journey. I didn't get to this place, and I'm still in this journey as well. And I'm grateful for my partner, and grateful for others in my community and in my circles that continue to sustain me and help me through that. It's definitely not based on my own volition or my own strength.
Right.
This is a reflection of my community.
And I think that's what as we age, or at least I feel like that as I'm aging, that I start to feel more like it's a constant journey, right? And that it's okay to be in that journey and not have to have solved the problem already, or solved, know everything already. And you answered one of the questions. Somebody asked you how old you were, and you just said 52. And I think maybe that's important, because people want to know, like, when do I get to that place? When do I have that aha moment, that realization, right? And I think that studying under people who have already had that aha moment, right, you can get to that earlier. You talked about healing 7 generations forward. And while we're doing the work now, like, I hope that while I'm doing the work, that my kids then will have had some of that already, right? And then their kids will have some of that already. And so it doesn't have to be at 52, it can be earlier, And then there are a bunch of questions. People are really loving, what you're talking about. Wendy asked a question, but I think she then followed it up to say that she answered her own question, or you answered it, Wendy. So if you could just let me know in the chat whether the question still needs to be answered, that would be great. I'm going to just move on to another question until she does that. Gabe Cole said, is it okay to be okay?
It's a great question. So the way I understand the question is it okay to be exactly who you are at this very moment? And my answer is, I think that is the cross section of healing, love, and transformation. Is if we are firmly aware of where we're at this very, very moment in our lives, where we're sitting, where we have our souls planted on this ground, on this earth. And I ask, if you're sitting, wiggle your toes so you could feel how you're planted, right? Connect with your body around this question. And the answer has to be absolutely, because this is where you're at this very moment. And our job is to be as fully present as we can, and then be able to listen and do the work of understanding where we will be 3 months from now, 6 months from now, and always being okay with where we're at this very moment, because it is a journey that is endless, but it's also sacred and beautiful. And I think that even the question of how old are you can be tricky, right? Because it could be a trick. Like, what if you're 52 and you're not where I'm at? And
Right.
then we begin this linear thinking, right? Linear thinking of time, and then we start beating ourselves up, or we start the negative talk that is wrapped up in white body supremacy, that we're not worthy, we're not enough, we that because of the false hierarchy, the false human hierarchy of value that is the construct of white body supremacy, that all begins, right? And so, there's a great quote, I think Brene Brown says, the biggest thief of joy is comparison.
Oh, yeah.
And so I think that's really critical. So we have to be okay with being okay right now where we're at, because it means that we're just looking inward and are being connected to our minds, our bodies, our ancestors, and are still. And if we're able to be still, then we're okay.
So that's sort of like a little bit like mindfulness practice, right? Being in that space and just like knowing, being aware of that moment and that time, and sitting in that space and being okay with where you are, and not having the pressure to like be, right or left or forward, but just being.
It's more than mindfulness, because I think mindfulness has been co-opted as a sort of these sort of strategies, or these sort of diluted question stems that we need to reflect.
Mm-hmm.
And the mindfulness that we need to do is to extricate ourselves from the system of white body supremacy and say, we could be in relationship to this system. We don't have to be in this system. Our liberation could be interdependent with one another and not dependent on the system. And so with that comes all of that notion of worthiness, of our own ability to be intellectually powerful people, that the system depends on us believing the opposite. And so it is mindfulness around decolonizing our mind, mindfulness around decolonizing our spirit, mindfulness around reclaiming our ancestral inherent wisdom and genius, so that we could be whole. And I love the word inherent, because it means no one can take our worthiness away. We are born worthy, regardless of the trauma that we experience, regardless of everything that white body supremacy wants to create, and depends on us feeling inferior and not worthy for the system itself to be sustained. Mindfulness is about reclaiming all of that, and being liberated and experiencing that wholeness and love in community and with one another. And it should be driving the work that we're doing on a daily basis to be more than okay.
So there are a bunch of other questions, but I would just like, for some of our viewers, because you and I have been doing this work for a while, but the concept of white body supremacy is foreign to some people. And we have a broad viewership here. We have Black and brown people, and we also have white viewers. And so if you could unpack that, what does white body supremacy mean? And what does it mean to Black and brown people? What does it mean to white people? Like, really unpack that for the viewers so they can understand that. And then I'll go back to answering some of the questions.
Sure. So I really recommend My Grandmother's Hands by Resmaa Menakem. It's a central text that really talks about the notion of trauma, of body, of whiteness, and of people of color. So I recommend that as a really critical text for all the viewers who are joining us. So white body supremacy basically just says the white body is the standard of which everything else will be measured. And so it is the foundation of our country, where whiteness became the ideal. Whiteness became what allowed you to be fully human in its laws, in its infrastructure, in its system. And it dates back all the way to Bacon's Rebellion, where Black and poor whites came together to throw off their white oppressor, which is the oligarchs who controlled all the land. And at that moment, they said, "Wait a second, this can't happen. It's going to completely buckle the infrastructure that we're creating as a new nation." And so this concept of being white, and then this concept of being different, this concept of being black, this concept of being enslaved, this concept of if you have one drop of black blood, you are black, this concept of property, all became formalized and structured in the fabric of our nation. And so that is what we're navigating, and that is the system that we continue to live and operate under. And there are benefits to that. There's advantages to that if you are a person who is white that you've inherited, and there are prices that we constantly are paying if you are not. And so I think those things are fairly evident, from George Floyd, but even through the entire history of the United States. And so that's in general the concept and the construct of white body supremacy, and all the things that we then navigate through as people of color.
So when you talked about, this transactional, this goes back to one of the questions, how do you remove the transactional side of things in your career? It says, having some of the roles that you mentioned, I can only imagine that the monetary aspects could blur your original reason for doing the work that you do, or was that not an issue? But I guess what I wanted to add to that with that question is, like, does the white body supremacy also, because that's ingrained in us, think about money, think about, excelling, think about perfectionism? I mean, there's tenets of white body supremacy that I don't know all of them to list them out right now, but those are some of the ones that are coming to my mind, like perfectionism, the right to be right, constantly having to be right. And so this wanting in your career to do something for money as opposed to doing it for your why, and how do you remove that?
Yeah, I think they don't have to be mutually exclusive of one another, right? We also have to be in a place where we need to work through and understand that we deserve shelter, we deserve a home, we deserve things that are beautiful, that will love and inspire us, and those are also inherent things. And so, but it's not that is not a struggle, right? So I think the difference is the struggle, and I've been fortunate and blessed to be present to the struggle, right? And so when I left the principal position, I knew I was never going to make that much money ever again. Mm-hmm. And I was okay with it, but it did bother me, right? It was a struggle, especially because I still carried the narrative of my parents and the oppressive nature of the poverty that they experienced. Mm-hmm. And so I needed to, again, continue doing that healing work in community. And one of my coaches said to me, do you want to continue carrying the narrative of your mother and of your father and their relationship to money, or do you want to create your own narrative? Mm-hmm. And the question is, I wanted to create my own narrative. But again, it's the importance is, are we aware of the struggle? And then are we using our values to help us, to root us, to anchor us in that struggle? And then are we also using community to help us navigate that struggle? It's not that's going to be easy, but what are the systems and cultures and rituals that we are creating around us to help us navigate and then help us be whole in that process?
Someone else asked, Iris asked, what is our why What if our why brings us massive financial gain? Won't that give us an edge as social justice warriors in society?
Yeah, I think sure. I think absolutely. I think my only wonder to that is, how are we struggling with our ability to consume as a result of that? Right? Because the more wealth that we create, and I think wealth creation is extremely important in Black BIPOC communities, especially because of all the systems that have been in place to counter that. But then the question is, how are we present and struggling around the fact that we're just consuming more and more and more and more as more wealth creation that we're able to generate. And so that would be a question that I would want to struggle with, and have people help me struggle with, so that I could find authenticity and honesty and truth in that struggle.
So you're talking about like, why do we need to have that amount of money? Is that what you're saying? Like, can you unpack that a little? Like, as I'm a little lost.
Sure. So, like, I dream about having lots of money so I could give lots of money away. And I think sometimes, we could dream about having lots and lots of money and lots of wealth. But then what happens is, what it reflects is that we just get bigger houses and more cars and more things, and we consume and consume more. And my only question is, are you struggling with that, based on a certain set of values, and based on what you're doing with that money to also empower and liberate others?
So going back to that idea of like, where does it come from that you need that money, or that you have the desire to have all of that? So like for you were saying like living in poverty caused you to have a desire to want more. And I'm thinking of a specific story from another person that I know, where they grew up in poverty, and the stories that they were telling themselves about buying, like, I didn't have, so now I need to buy this, I didn't have, so I need to buy this, or, I need to eat this, or I need to, do these things because I didn't have, so is that story, that you're telling yourself, well, I need to have this money, and then I can, like you said, dream of giving it away, but what could you do now in the moment to help society, to heal, to be a social justice warrior without money? What does that look like without having money? And I think going back to, one of the things I wanted to talk about was like Native American, indigenous people. They're struggling for their recognition and for the preservation of their homelands, and some of the communities have the casinos, right? But not all of the communities have the casinos. And there's a specific area right now in Arizona where the government is trying to go in and take that land back to make copper, to dig for copper, to mine for copper, right? So there's a whole lot of money that's going to be gained in that space by digging in that area. But this is native land that is sacred. This was for ceremonial purposes. This is for, rites of passage purposes. This is for just living in your authenticity in your native culture. And yet there is money to be had. So they're going to take the land away. So you could do it without money, right? You can fight for justice without money, but you're then coming up against this dynamic where they're more powerful than you. And I think maybe that's connected to that person's question, is like, how do you do it ultimately without money?
Yeah, I think that's a really complex question. I don't know if I have the answer. I think my only invitation is, can we think of other types of wealth that we have? Can we think about cultural wealth? Can we think about wealth in community? Can we think about different definitions of wealth and capital, outside of the powerful economic wealth that could be so destructive and harmful, and at the same time can help us really address some systemic inequities that have been historically in place. And so I think reparations, I think issues of giving back native land and repairing that harm are necessary. And quite frankly, it's going to take money. So encouraged by the Jesuit order, who recently acknowledged that the Jesuit Catholic Church, like Georgetown University and other universities Jesuit universities across the United States, profited from the selling of enslaved African people, and have recognized that, and have gone back and found descendants of those people, and have just committed $100 million, $100 million for reparations of those descendants, and have formed a committee of descendants and Jesuit priests to decide how are they going to distribute those $100 million to even just begin a granular piece of sand to begin this notion and this thought of reparations, to heal from that historical trauma and historical profiting that the Catholic Church has done. And that's just one example. So I think money is important in this matrix, but at the same time, it cannot be the only way that we come to healing and collective liberation. But I think it's an important way to acknowledge some of the harms that have been created.
Yeah. So we're going to be finishing up in a little bit, but I wanted to bring up, you and I had talked about this sort of in emailing, that I won a residency to go to Mexico to, yay me. And I'm going to be there for 4 weeks in, why am I drawing a blank on where I'm going, Rito?
Puebla, the summer.
Puebla, yeah, thank you. I'm going to Puebla, Mexico for
Puebla.
Oh, is it Puebla? Okay.
Puebla, yeah.
Puebla, thank you. For 4 weeks. And I'm going to be interviewing the Afro-Mexican community there and doing some portraits and hopefully collecting some artifacts from that community. And I wanted to talk with you because you're a Mexican descendant. And I wanted to talk to you about your thoughts about the divisiveness between the Afro-Mexican community and the Mexican community. And what I hear a lot when I bring up this conversation in Latinx communities, because going back a little bit in history, the Spanish did a little bit differently the way they colonized than the Americans. In the Spanish culture, it was okay to mix. They actually wanted that. And one of I can't really pronounce this properly. I'm going to put it on one of the banners, but it's mejorar la raza.
Yep.
That's one of
improve the race.
Improve the race. And that was the whole point of it, was to keep marrying white and white and white, so that, eventually there wouldn't be the bad parts of the race. And so when you talk to a lot of people in the Latinx community, they say there's no racism. And they say that yes, I have a lot of people say to me, we don't have racism. We don't see color. There's no difference between, the darker skin and the lighter skin. And we know this, to be untrue, because we know that even like in Cuba, Dominican Republic, in Mexico, the darker you are, when you have some Black, African descendants, you're stopped more disproportionately. Your wealth is lower. Your poverty is higher in those communities. And I just wonder, from your perspective as growing up in America in a Latinx community, but also I'm going back and forth, what are your thoughts on that? And maybe you can give me some insights for my study.
Yeah. So again, when white is the standard, everything that is not white is less than, right? Which is white body supremacy. And white body supremacy is alive and well in Mexico, along with patriarchy, which is a part of that's really cemented and uplifted and undergirded by religion, the Catholic Church. And so just to paint a picture of how deep this is, African Mexicans were not recognized in the census till this past year.
Mm-hmm.
It's taken that long for Mexico to finally grapple with the fact that there was over 250,000 enslaved African people that were brought to Mexico, let alone Mexican people understanding that not only are they the white standard, right, which is where it undergirds this notion of improving the race, mejorar la raza, but they're also indigenous as well. And so the denial, the anti-Blackness is significant in Latin America. It's significant in Latin America because of this notion the white body is the standard. Mm-hmm. And the anti-indigeneity is significant. And so we have to reconcile and heal and understand our anti-indigeneity or our indigenous identity as Mexican people, and integrate how we heal and understand our African identity as Mexican people to even begin to approach this notion of really understanding who we are. And so it is extremely complex, and it is very, very difficult work, because you have populations of people, those that have been most marginalized, those that have experienced the most poverty, are the people that are either more indigenous looking or more African looking. Mm-hmm. And those that have more rights and access are those that have more advantage, are those that are more white. And the colorism that's similar in both Black and Latin American communities is alive and well currently, let alone the patriarchy that has also oppressed women, and the amount of femicide that exists in Mexico and in a lot of Latin American countries. And so all those are intertwined, and it's extremely complex. But at the same time, we could also find those pearls of beauty, of survival, of resilience, of identity, which is, I'm so excited to see what you capture, because I know that is what you will capture. You will capture images of people saying, but we are still here.
Yeah.
And we are okay.
Yeah, I think it's really powerful. It has become more and more, I don't want to say popular, but people are understanding that the transatlantic slave trade was so broad. It wasn't like just dropped off in the United States. It wasn't just the British enslaving, Americans or here in America. It was so broad. Brazil has one of the largest, African populations, from the enslaved people. But then you go into these little tiny places where you don't think that Africans were brought to, like Colombia, like Peru, like Mexico. And there are these cultures there that are thriving. They still have their African roots. They still have things that they, I saw on Henry Louis Gates, he did a whole series on going through South America. And one of the things he brought up was the dance and the song La Bamba, mm-hmm. that comes from, West Africa. Mm-hmm. The roots of that song and the roots of the dance steps to that. And it's like, who knew that? It became popularized, in popular culture. And you just think that it's, like a fun Latin song, but it really goes back to African roots. And these are things that we don't know, like it's not being taught in the school system. I'm sure it's not being taught in the school system in Mexico. And even here, we don't know these things. We don't know how so many things got preserved in the African diaspora that really need to be publicized and talked about. And that's what I hope to do when I get there. Mm-hmm.
And this is why this is so true. Our collective liberation is dependent on the liberation of Black people. Period. Mm-hmm. Period. Because of that, what you just shared is exactly why that is so true. If we are able to collectively liberate Black people around the world and in this country, then every other oppressed people will follow.
That's so powerful. So powerful.
And so we have to approach this work from that perspective. And it's critically important. So I want to just leave a quote from Sister Wahid to bless all of us and to wrap up, and to hopefully that we could take something.
Before you do that one quote, just
Yes.
one quick question. Were you always vocal about white body supremacy, and how did you deal with the denial of racism in the school system amongst your peers?
Yeah, that's a good 15-minute.
Oh no!
Again, it's been a journey, right? It's been a journey of healing. But when I realized that my job was to help my students understand who they were, that is when that transition happened. Because I also needed to understand who I was, and I needed to understand who I was outside of the dominant narrative, the dominant culture. And so that's where the healing came. And so here's the quote by Sister Wahid. It says, "I love my people. I will never not love us. I cannot. It is a blood love, a cellular love, an infinite water, and it will sustain all trauma. It has sustained all trauma. This love is older and wilder than the world itself. And it multiplies in life with every death, and it is unstoppable." May we all be unstoppable. Yeefah, may you be unstoppable.
Thank you. This is a great launch to my podcast series, my first inaugural episode with Rito Martinez. And I want to implore you guys to log on in 2 weeks when I will be interviewing another really amazing person who is a doorman, trilingual, an art dealer, and an art collector. And you will find out some really amazing things about him. What is it like to be Eve? And thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Rito, for joining me, and peace out.